From one moment to the next, James was suddenly seeing stars, a pressing and pounding feeling emanating from the middle of his face. "Penny for your thoughts?" Andrej offered, crossing his arms with a bemused grin on his face, while James carefully inspected the pounding mass on his face that used to be his nose with his fingers. "What?" James mumbled, with a slight slur in his voice, having not quite regained his wits after the direct hit the Major had landed to his face. It wasn't that bad. Nothing appeared to be broken and he wasn't even bleeding. But he would still complain about it. "You're distracted. I want to know why," Andrej said, untangling his arms to gesture with open palms in both directions, while his crimson eyes stared up at James. "Usually you'd at least try to stop a jab like that." James indignantly pressed out some air for his nose, mostly to test if he could still do so without problem, but also to give voice to his displeasure. He couldn't have asked that before punching him in the face? "Strange question, sir," he replied, trying to sound much friendlier than he felt and using the formality to give his words the least bit of venom. "What isn't on my mind right now?" Andrej rolled his crimson eyes and his grin slightly faltered as he recrossed his arms. "Can't ever get a straight answer with you, can I?" he said, not even pretending to keep up any form of etiquette while talking to James, despite his position. "I mean, what's bothering you right now, to the point you can't even see a punch to your face coming?" James's first instinct was to reply, "Nothing you need to concern yourself with," but then he remembered his resolution about not doing exactly that all the time anymore. "The elections," he replied instead. Finally feeling confident that his nose wasn't going to fall off his face anytime soon, he pulled his hands back and got back into a defensive stance, despite the pounding sensation still present on his face. "Don't know if you know that yet, but we got confirmation that the data packages have arrived with the government. We're probably going to have our identities checked later today." Andrej did not yet return to a fighting stance. Instead, he looked up into the air and started to ruminatively rub his chin, as if deeply lost in thought. "Right, I heard about that," he stated, thinking aloud, while his eyes moved left to right, seemingly scanning over something that wasn't actually there. "The news were also going crazy this morning. It seems that everyone wants to be the next Nostradamus and predict the future." James scoffed, dropping his hands again as it didn't seem like the Major was going to throw a punch anytime soon. "It's simple math, nothing to do with prophecy," he said, finally relaxing his stance as well and standing up to his full height. "Same stuff that's going on before any of our elections." Andrej chuckled and shook his head with closed eyes, his tightly bound hair accentuating the movement by swinging left to right. "I was talking about different news," he informed James with a single dismissive wave of his hand. James furrowed his brow suspiciously. "Don't tell me you've been getting into conspiracies now," he half joked, half stated, and looked at his superior with suspicious apprehension. This time, Andrej laughed a bit louder. "Well, we're living through one, aren't we?" he countered at that, and James had to begrudgingly admit that he wasn't entirely wrong with that. However, Andrej hadn't gone quite that far off the deep end yet, and moved to alleviate James's worries after a moment of bathing in his perceived disappointment. "But no, not conspiracies per se, just a different kind of prediction. The kind that influences the vote instead of the one about the vote." At first, James wondered what that was supposed to mean. Then it clicked. "The popular opinion, then," he guessed, his voice sporting the same annoyance that Andrej had earlier when not getting a straight answer. "Only marginally better than conspiracy theories, if you ask me." Bemusedly, Andrej pressed his lips together and waved his head left to right to concede with a sheepish look on his face. "Not inaccurate," he admitted, and clearly some of the more interesting takes on the situation he had read this morning were going through his mind once again. "But it can tell you a lot about the way things are going, even beyond the scope of just this election. For example, did you know that your ideas are much more popular with the more capitalistic societies of the community? While they aren't sure if they want to see you in the council yet, they are pretty into the idea of putting pressure on the council, it seems." Andrej interestedly raised an eyebrow while waiting for James's response, while James just briefly sighed. He did, in fact, know that. Even if he hadn't obsessed over the calculations, numbers, and opinions himself, it had been done for him before. Of course, back then he was promoting different values, but it wasn't a stretch to know that people who didn't like what he did before would have more open of an ear now. "I can't imagine why," he admitted, feeling that his speeches hadn't been of any specific socioeconomic nature so far. "But apparently I am also slightly more popular among the dominant genders, whatever that means." He had gotten that tidbit of information from Admir, who had apparently been quite eager to pass it on to James during their morning run. If James had to guess, he probably just thought the phrasing was funny. The only thing James got out of it was being not just slightly disconcerted at the amount of data that was collected about some very specific groups' opinions on both his public image and him personally. Species, gender, socioeconomic standing. It seemed there wasn't a box people weren't sorted into when surveying the topic. Apparently, Andrzej could sense that James wasn't entirely comfortable with the topic, and seeing as it wasn't one of the more personally involved problems he faced, both men were quickly comfortable wordlessly dropping it without further mention. Searching for a Sieg, Andrzej briefly nodded downwards to James's right. "How's the arm?" he asked, in the same tone somebody would inquire about the weather on the space station. "The usual," James gave back, presenting the appendage as if he was flexing its non-existent muscles. "Nothing changed just yet." He had briefly mentioned Curie's offer of a new arm to the Major and the rest of his old team. However, he had not yet had time to further discuss any specifics with them. However, more than talking that topic out, Andrzej seemed to be interested in both distracting James and keeping up the reprogression of his training. "Tried it for fencing yet?" he asked, candidly putting his hands on his hips with a slight sparkle in his red eyes. But although he still had other things in his mind, James somewhat mirrored his enthusiasm. He hadn't had a partner to practice his swordplay with for a while now, and from what he had gathered during his time back, the same was pretty much true for Andrzej. "You did come back with that fancy captain's sword after all." Although James still had to hold back the urge to correct him on the use of the term fencing in this context. "Not yet," he replied, still finding himself quite open to the suggestion. "You want to give it a swing? Full disclosure though, I am probably rusty as all hell. Belphegor really got his claws on me." "Well, then it's all the more important that we get you trading again," the Major replied, encouragingly. James nodded and started to turn on his heels to fetch the trainee swords, as well as some basic armor to protect their more important bits. However, Andrzej shut down his mood with an outstretched hand against James's shoulder. "I'll get it," he said, making a step past James towards the door. "You'll take 5 and get your focus back. Rusty or not, I want you to put up at least a bit of a fight." Usually, the order of ranks would have dictated that James go fetch the equipment, but he wouldn't argue against a direct order to not put in extra effort. However, before he could acknowledge it with more than a nod, both of the men were suddenly distracted by the crashing noise of someone taking a heavy tumble, combined with a quick yelp of surprise, and the following sound of someone skidding over the floor for a bit, before coming to a halt with a pained exhale. They both shot around, seeing the slender form of Athena curling on the floor a few meters away from a treadmill that seemingly ran at full throttle. Within mere moments, they both knew what had happened, and hurried over with unabashed worry. While nobody was perfect and accidents during training could happen, a mistake like being flung off a treadmill was very much unlike the usually very skilled captain. After a few seconds of breathing away the pain, Athena was already in the process of getting back up by herself, even before any of the worried surrounding people had reached her. She rubbed her back with a pained expression on her face, but seemed otherwise uninjured, except for maybe her pride. Tuya, who'd been standing next to the treadmill as she was running on it, was the first to reach her, immediately going to her knees next to the blonde Amazon. "Are you alright?" she asked, hovering her hand in front of her as if unsure if she should inspect Athena for injuries, or just let her assess the situation herself. Athena swiped some hair that had loosened up out of her ponytail away from her face with an open palm and took another deep breath. "How fast was that?" she then asked, instead of replying, and looked back up at the treadmill expectantly. Everyone around took a relieved breath. That certainly sounded like she wasn't worried, so the tumble she had taken had likely looked and sounded a lot scarier than it actually was. Tuya demonstratively wiped some sweat off her forehead and chuckled briefly, before also glancing back at the treadmill. 30 kilometers an hour, she replied, clearly answering from memory as there was no way she could see the machine's display from where she kneeled. "Pretty fast, but you won't be breaking any records with that." Athena released some air through her nose and pulled her legs in, so she could ponderingly support her elbows in her knees, while leaning her head into her hands. "That's still 32 slow," she mumbled to herself, just as James and Andrzej finally arrived at her location. 32 slow? There was no way she would reach 60 kilometers per hour. It just wasn't humanly possible. Why would she even want that? Tuya scoffed at the taller woman and got up, reaching out her hand in an offer to pull Athena to her feet. Despite likely not needing any help, Athena grabbed the outstretched hand with a loud slap and allowed herself to be pulled up. "Ever heard of not picking fights you can't win?" Tuya said, a slight chuckle of relieved amusement still present in her voice, even after she had calmed down a bit. "I know she's new, but you still won't ever be able to outrun her." Once again, it suddenly clicked for James what this was about, as he finally glanced over to the benches, where Admir was currently busy spotting Rashida, as she got familiar with the type of weight she was able to lift in high gravity, although the two had also paused and looked over in surprise when Athena had taken her fall. Due to her stamina situation, the feline hadn't joined in any of the endurance-based training that was done by the soldiers in a larger group in the morning. However, she had instead warmed up afterwards with some running on the treadmill, and apparently that had been more than enough to gain both Athena's attention and her competitive spirit. "You can't be serious," James said, with a bit of disappointment in his voice, that she had nearly gotten herself injured for something like that. "You know you can't run like a Miat, we're not built for it." Athena scowled at him with narrowing eyes. "I also know I can't lift as much as you, especially not now," she countered abrasively, and started to pull out her hair tie in order to redo her ponytail, letting her long blonde hair fly free for a moment in the process. "Doesn't mean I can't stick it as my goalpost anyway." That was hardly comparable. "Just don't hurt yourself, Sam," Andres said in a both caring and admonishing tone, a bit of professional worry still clearly visible on his face. "Yes, sir," Athena replied, and gave a quick yet respectful salute before returning to binding her hair together tightly. Right after, Andres turned to James again, nodding with a smile, before moving to fetch their equipment once more. As expected, James had gotten a good thrashing while training with Andrej, as was usually the case when they measured against each other in Swordplay. Now even more so since James was completely and utterly out of practice when compared to his older superior. Despite the rudimentary armor he wore for training purposes, he could still clearly feel the places the dummy sort of made contact with him whenever he hadn't paid enough attention or didn't get out of the way fast enough, even after he had stood in line to confirm his identity to the ship's computer sometime later. For the election to go smoothly, this was done a bit beforehand, so everyone just had to quickly set their cross later at their own convenience whenever they had time, as to not hold anything up for too long. And despite the unfavourable circumstances of the election itself, it was still treated with the respect such an event deserved, which meant that anyone not essential for the function or safety of the ship was getting most of their day off to both vote and study the election's results in peace. And even those who were essential were only working a half shift, getting relief by replacements halfway through. Only the highest officers on board would still take on their full duties during the event. Of course, this luxury was only afforded to the crew since they had by now reached the relative safe haven of the human territories and would not have to worry about any sudden attacks. Anyway, it afforded James the opportunity to spend the day, mostly, away from his duties and hang out in the lower gravity areas, together with everyone who wanted to join him instead. Although his attention still remained mostly fixed on the computer terminal screen, showing a non-stop flow of news specifically about the upcoming election. One that was already heralded as the most important in a very long time. The clock called out the next hour. In Earth time, the day just went on as normal. However, in Galactic Uniform time, the first day of the first week of the 50th month of the uniform year had just broken. The vote on whether the council of more than 100 years was going to persist for another term had begun. The council in this case being a stand-in for many more important galactic positions, apart from the council members as well. And with it, although a lot less important, also the decision about James's future. Within the first short uniform minute of the uniform day, everyone in the room had already cast their votes. Everyone in this case included James, Shida, Moore, Curie, who had taken a well-deserved break from their work on James's possible new arm, Nia, James's old team plus First Lieutenant Tuya, and even Konglorch had managed to wind himself out of his people's tight grip to be along for the ride. For the moment, he didn't wish to speak of why exactly he had been sought after, ever since humanity and its allies had started to close their borders with the community. However, James was still glad to have him along for the event. He remembered what a rock the Plated Titan's presence had been for him back on the Great Community Station, and he hadn't forgotten just how thankful he was for that quite yet. With all of these people around, even Moore's quiet, spacious, and sparingly furnished accommodation was pretty well filled, and therefore everyone was more or less forced to mingle with each other as they stared up towards the computer screen, leading to the forming of some interesting groups, wherever the pre-formed cliques are joined with each other. Admittedly, James had a feeling that the humans of the impromptu gathering were trying their best to make the off-worlders feel as included as they could, even as everyone was nervously observing the shifting numbers on the screen. Far left in the room, Athena had somehow managed to engage Curie in a conversation, after the cyborg had seemingly been interested in the black ring James had gifted to his colleague so many years ago. He couldn't really hear the conversation, but imagined its content to be quite enlightening, although he didn't quite know for who of the two. Tuya, who had at first tried to connect with the cyborg over their shared work in the med-ent area, sat cross-legged on the floor next to them. However, after the first lieutenant had quite quickly noticed that she, despite obviously being quite technically gifted, couldn't exactly keep up with Curie's engineering knowledge in any meaningful way, her attention had soon shifted to Nia, who was sitting on Moore's large but low bed, right next to the giant old lady. Currently, James's sister was excitedly recounting some of her discoveries and recent hypotheses about her research of possible linked evolutionary features that developed together on different planets independently, which was well known across the galaxy, despite the mystery of their origins being still completely unresolved. Her sheer excited energy had the two women hanging onto her every word, although James had the feeling that Tuya also understood very little of what was being said. She still gave it her best effort, and every now and then, even raised some interesting questions. But James was only half listening, as he was already quite familiar with the subject since he had helped Nia work on it in the past, when they still studied together. He sat and leaned against the right corner of the bed together with Shida, the two of them facing an enormous cupboard, against which the remaining members of James's old team, Andrej and Admir, leaned. Finally, quite tightly nestled between the bed and the cupboard, in the right corner of the room, lay the giant form of Konglorch, who studied the group of trained Deathworlders in front of him with clear interest in his eyes, his 4 fiery eyes constantly moving and scanning across each and every one of them. On the screen, they could all watch as a large wave of early votes was flooding in, largely in favour of a disbanding of the current council. Somehow, James had the vague feeling that maybe the humans and Turnip had all gone for an early vote, although he obviously couldn't be sure about that. Whatever the case may be, right now, the votes against a reinstating of the council were far outweighing those in favour of it. However, the day was also very young. In the meantime, just so he wouldn't lose his mind while staring at the slowly changing numbers, James also engaged in some conversation, trying to distract himself as they all waited for the time to tick down. "It's not that I don't want the new arm," he explained, as the topic had of course inevitably come up once more. He quickly slipped out of the jacket of his uniform to more directly present the synthetic appendage, specifically to Konglorch, who had not yet had any time to inspect the replacement for himself. "I mean, it looks pretty freaking sweet when compared to this one. I wouldn't really mind another surgery either, it's just, I feel like that would just be deferring the problem instead of actually dealing with it. I mean, what if I didn't have the opportunity to just change it when I feel like it? I would have to live with this prosthetic and deal with it, you know?" He gestured around with his current arm, and looked at it up and down as if he needed to inspect it once more just to make extra sure that he really didn't like it. "It would feel like I'm running away." He finalized his thoughts, and tightly pressed his lips together afterwards while furrowing his brow. Konglorch let out a loud, almost bone-shaking bellow as he leaned down so one of his fiery eyes could closely inspect the robotic arm, with only slight apprehension in his movement. "It is admirable that you wish to face this challenge head-on," the Titan mused aloud, each word revealing the rows of dagger-like teeth in his barely moving mouth, and his words basically mirrored what James had thought he would say on the matter. However, it was only until the Turnip suddenly clarified, "Arable, but foolish at long last." James confusedly shot around to look up at the giant, unsure of what he was trying to tell him. Konglorch, who had apparently expected as much, amusedly scratched over the floor with the large maulers on his front feet, and even slightly tilted his head aside to get an even better look at the dancer staring up at him. "Honestly, I'm with the big guy in this one," Admir chimed in, with his hands folded behind his head and his eyes closed, as he relaxedly lounged against the large cupboard of dark wood. "I don't see the problem with deferring a problem that ceases to be one as soon as you do. Feels like the logical thing to do for me." Of course he'd say that. Taking the problem entirely literally like that, it of course sounded pretty simple. "Ultimately, it is a waste of resources," Konglorch concurred, and added to Admir's stance on things, gesturing with his large arms in a way that seemed to be imitating the way James tended to talk, with his hands to a degree. "All the energy you would have to invest to try and deal with your current arm could be invested into many of your more pressing concerns, should the new arm actually resolve that issue. Keeping your upper arm, however, could hardly save any resources apart from a day spent for surgery and recovery, since the new arm has already been made, as you sounded quite sure that it would at least not make your situation any worse. All in all, it does sound pretty logical to me. As if to underline his statement, his long tail softly lifted and lightly smacked onto the floor with a dull, fleshy sound. Well, there was certainly one way to look at it. Still, as much as James subscribed to the minds over Haas philosophy, he still had to admit that logic was of little help when dealing with a purely emotional issue. Still, there was at least help to alleviate his worries somewhat. Finally, Andrej also spoke up, probably seeing the still pondering expression on James's face. So, not that I'm trying to talk you into it or anything. I still think that decision is entirely yours to make. He carefully approached the topic and leaned forwards, putting his hands on the knees of his crossed legs while waiting until he had James's full attention before he continued. But I just want to say, as long as no one gets hurt, there's nothing wrong with just walking away from something that makes you unhappy. I mean, you did it in the past, right, with all of this? Nobody held it against you then, and nobody will hold this against you now. You really should just go for whatever makes you happier. Everything else is secondary. What do you really have to lose? Despite their sometimes unsettling nature, his crimson eyes were candid and honest, as James looked back into him. Despite his position, Andrej was scarcely stoic, and never cold. However, he also didn't tend to get quite so touchy-feely whenever the situation didn't entirely call for it. So either James had caught him in a rare mood, or Andrej was taking this whole deal about his arm quite seriously. James smiled back at his old boss. I'll keep it in mind, but I still can't help but wonder what would be if I didn't have the choice, he forced himself to earnestly say, despite his apprehension to do so, before he allowed himself to deflect with humour like he would usually do. At this point, maybe I should put it up to a vote as well. I've got him on the politicians in the meantime, after all. He heard an impish smacking of lips next to him, and turned his attention towards Sheeda, who looked at him with a mischievous smile, with both ears turned in his direction. Didn't you just recently say that you don't like to wonder what ifs? She lovingly teased him with his own words, to which he honestly had no retort at the time. He just breathlessly laughed back at her in a, well, you got me, kind of gesture. Speaking of votes and politics, it seems like the core worlds are starting to wake up now. Andrej suddenly interrupted them, and nodded sideways. His red eyes affixed to the screen. As everyone else looked over as well, they were greeted by the sight of the votes in favour of reinstating the council, rising in real time. For the last minutes, there had been a constant trickle of votes that had been relatively evenly distributed between both sides, not really making a difference in the overall percentiles. But now, it seemed that the gap between the two opinions was getting smaller and smaller by the moment. Although it was likely none of them had ever truly expected their massive early lead to stay that way for the entire duration of the election, it was still disheartening to see their political opponents gain ground so quickly, and so everyone just quietly looked at the screen for a while with expressionless faces. Finally, our voice pierced the silence. So, how sure are we that this whole thing isn't rigged against us? Tuya asked into the quiet room, her voice strong despite the clear hesitation in it, asking for a friend. I don't think sure is the right word in this case, James gave back, and wiped a bit of sweat off his forehead with his fingertips. More hopeful. It's not like the numbers are in our favour in the first place. After all, the overall most likely people to vote in their favour were Deathworlders and maybe Predators or Carnivores. Carnivores made up about 10% of the community's species, Deathworlders about 5%, and considering that a good number of Deathworlders were Carnivores, those numbers didn't even perfectly add up to 15% of the species. Granted, some Deathworlders, like humans and Miet for example, had very high populations when compared to the average, meaning 15% of the species didn't really mean 15% of the population either. But in the end, they still couldn't weigh up the rest of the galaxy. It was hard to say if they even weighed up all of the core worlds. So, the bulk of the vote would be decided by everyone in between the factions, the proverbial swing species, so to say. And their decision could really go in either direction. It was unlikely that they would know whether or not the vote had been manipulated once they saw the final results. Luckily for the galaxy at large, it didn't matter much. The people responsible for the crimes that had been committed would be persecuted and brought to justice, one way or another. No matter their office, they weren't immune. The only thing that was decided today would be if James would turn his fate over to the court of law very soon, or if he was to remain protected by communal law for just a while longer. That would remain to be seen. Slowly, everyone watched on as the votes silently started to even out. Sometimes those in favour of reinstation even briefly overtook those against it, only for the tides to turn again shortly after, and vice versa. Despite everyone putting on their best brave face, the tension in the room became increasingly intense and noticeable over time, and soon everyone turned to more direct and personal ways of distracting themselves. Nia, Athena and Tuya all stood huddled around each other, looking down at Nia's phone and apparently watching some kind of video. Since James didn't want to get up and look at it as well, he could only rely on the vague sense of the content the audio gave him, as well as their comments on it to figure out what it might be about. "And there she goes," Nia said in a half-amused, half-disappointed tone, as the phone speakers let out a shrill shriek of what was presumably a woman. "I told you she was going to eat shit," Tuya commented with a soft chuckle, while the panicked screech gave way to more continuous screaming from the speakers. "Yep, that's Ravine's car now." Athena finalized the live commentary of the video, that had apparently been about someone chasing their car as it was rolling towards a cliff, and presumably falling flat on her face in the process. Moore and Curie were looking over the women's shoulders interestedly, but simply couldn't quite get the same amusement out of the ongoing picture show they were putting on with their phones. Meanwhile, Andrej and Admir had taken to play some form of digital card game against each other on their respective phones, while James and Shida quietly signed to each other about everything and nothing, not wanting to disturb anyone with their conversation. "For a while there, I actually thought you might be mad at me for signing up with your mother so quickly," Shida sighed, referring to the good, while James had become rather isolated from everyone. "I told you, that was your decision," James replied, after honestly not even thinking too much about it. "Besides, if you didn't sign up, it's likely that you would have been sent away sooner or later. Can't exactly keep refugees around on a ship like this." While that clearly hadn't been Shida's main motivation, her reaction of lifting her eyebrows slightly and giving him a slightly impressed smile told him that she, at least, had that fact in mind as well, at least at some point. But then her ears slightly sank, and she looked at him sadly with big eyes. "But you could be sent away pretty soon," she signed, glancing over at the competing numbers in front of them. "Are you really sure you want to do this? I don't think anyone thinks you should." Before she had even seen his answer, her head sank to his shoulder. "I think I should," James whispered, knowing fully well that many would disagree with his actions, but he rarely had been so sure about anything in his life. For his deeds, he wanted to be held accountable, be that smart or not, just like he wanted those he stood against to be held accountable for what they had done. If what he did was right or wrong was not for him to decide, he would give that up and see where it took him. Maybe he would be set free, if the cause outweighed his actions. Maybe he wouldn't. Either way, for him, it was the right thing to do, even if it wasn't for everybody. He certainly wouldn't demand from anybody in his position to follow his example. Either spurred up by his whispering, or just seeing the glum look on James's face as he put his arms around Shida, Admir suddenly scooted over closer to him. "Hey, James," he said in a hushed tone, and leaned in a bit closer, causing both James and Shida to look at him expectantly, wondering why he interrupted them. Admir simply turned his phone around, pointing a screen in their direction with a strange picture on it. "Look." James narrowed his eyes to try and make out what was on the screen. The picture was pretty small and honestly not of the best quality, so it took a moment before he deciphered what he was seeing. It showed an object. Round, grey, with 4 legs at the bottom and a thick rim on top, seemingly made of cast iron or something of the like. It seemed to be some form of kettle or maybe pot, old and decrepit, but overall recognisable. Although it had a strange feature. On one side, the walls weren't perfectly round. Instead, there seemed to be some form of ornament or decoration forgot or cast into them. A large cylindrical protrusion snuck out of the side underneath 2 dots, and on the flat top of the protrusion were 2 more smaller dots. Together, the so-formed snout and eyes made it look somewhat like a very round pig. And while that was a kind of cute demonstration of ancient craftsmanship, James didn't quite get the punchline at first. However, Admir had to hold back laughter. It's a hogpot," Admir finally said, while fighting back snickers, and James's immediate reaction was to press his eyes shut tight and groan in frustration. The joke, of course, only made sense in English, and therefore Shida was quite confused by both. Admir's sentence and James's reaction to it. However, it didn't take long for James to start very hesitantly chuckling and shaking his head, which allowed her the insight that it had likely been what it was, a dumb joke. "Why are you the way you are?" James finally asked, massaging his still tightly shut eyes with 2 fingers, while blindly turning towards Admir. "Shut up, you love me," Admir replied with a confident laugh, and pulled his phone back, presumably to return to the game he had interrupted, just to try and alleviate James's stress in the worst way possible. Well, maybe not quite the worst. James could hear the trouble behind that laugh, although he knew that Admir would refuse to give in to it. Not now. Not ever. Still, his quite blunt attempt at cheering up James had worked somewhat. At least it pulled him out of a momentary funk. And while Shida seemed no less worried than before, at least his more positive mood also had a positive effect on her. For a moment, James wondered who else was currently watching the results of the vote, and what their thoughts on the matter might be. Did it matter to them at all? Or did they already plan for it ever since it became clear that a disbanding of the current council was even a possibility? He wasn't sure. In the last hours of the uniformed day, the race to the finish remained head-to-head, with sometimes only fractions of a percentile separating the two possible outcomes. Every time one side overtook the other, there was a spike of nervous energy in the room that would only slowly die down. If it had been manipulated, it had been made to look close. The 10th hour slowly ran its course. 10 minutes left. 5, 3, 1. Then, the first day of the 50th month was over, and with it, the vote had concluded. The entire room held its collective breath. Votes in favour of reinstating the current Galactic Council and corresponding offices, 51.62%. Votes against reinstating the current Galactic Council and corresponding offices, 48.38%. The vote was over. Their side had lost. What remained was only to see who would fill the empty seat in the council, but it hardly mattered. Once the short election of a single seat was over, James's immunity would end, and he would turn himself in. He could hear some sharp breaths being sucked in around him. Hands and claws were raised towards lips in disbelief. Emotions were barely held back all around him. He felt Sheeta's hand close tightly around his. He, however, felt very little. In all honesty, it probably hadn't yet caught up to him, what he saw and felt. For the moment, he was oddly peaceful, in a blanket of nothingness. "Well, we had a good run," he said tonelessly, feeling his voice come close to breaking as he spoke, although he didn't yet know why. "Everyone, give them hell for me." Before anyone had the chance to reply or voice their own thoughts on the matter, the picture showing the results of the vote was replaced. Instead on screen, now, was the form of a massive off-worlder. A core-worlder, in fact. 4 long ears stood up like crescent moon shapes from their round head. Short, grey fur with interment, darker stripes covering the massive rotund body that was connected to the head with a stocky neck. The face covered in thin, almost gill-like nostrils beneath 2 offset, multi-irised eyes, and above a wide, cavernous mouth. James recognized him, although he had only seen pictures of him so far, and he had been much younger in those. Councilman Efron of the Pethanusis people looked into the camera cross-eyedly, his interlocked irises struggling to get a single fix on the camera. "My beloved community," he said slowly, the ache showing in his words despite the still remarkable strength of his voice. "Today, you, our people, have spoken, and you have spoken loud and clear, but you have not said what many might think you have." Each word he said he also signed with his 4-fingered, dexterous hands, and he paused dramatically for a moment before he continued. "I have been chosen to speak to you, as the longest member of the council that is not currently accused of, quite simply put, heinous deeds. Accusations that this council can and will not take lightly," he said, and took a deep breath. "But those are just words. I can say them all day long, they won't change a thing. Words have been exchanged all day. The Galactic Council has come together, long before the election had reached its end, and seeing the result, we have come to a conclusion, and that is that the time of words alone has passed." Again he paused, and he shut his eyes for a moment, holding on to the podium in front of him, seemingly gathering his willpower and resolve before he could say what he had to. When he lifted his gaze again, he spoke with even more strength in his voice than before, his vocal cords booming out every word, as if he wanted to make the entire galaxy hear him without the use of microphones and cameras. "Today we have gotten a message from the galaxy. A message that nearly half of its occupants cannot and will not put their trust in this current council anymore," he proclaimed, lifting his head up high into the spotlights that shone down on him. And although we are very thankful that a small majority still deem us worthy to lead this galaxy despite it all, we have reached the conclusion that it is simply not enough. If almost half of our people cannot put their faith in us, it might as well be that no one can. A divide like this is simply unacceptable. Therefore, we have decided that hereby the vote of the reinstatement of the Council is officially accepted, and the first action of this newly reinstated Council is the following disbanding of the current Galactic Council. This is effective immediately, and preparations for the election of a new Galactic Council will begin henceforth. While I know this might be disappointing for some of you, who are glad to have won the election, please do not fret. If you still want to put your trust in us, you must merely do so again during the next election. However, we hope that this course of action will restore the Galactic community's unified trust in its leadership, as soon as the new Council will take its seat. And to all of those who believe that we are no longer trustworthy in our position, please, take this as a gesture of good faith.